People often misunderstand what they're dealing with when they encounter an empath. They see patience and assume passivity. They see understanding and assume tolerance. They see kindness and assume weakness. But that interpretation says more about their perception than it does about the empath's reality. Because empathy, in its true form, is not a lack of strength, it's a heightened form of awareness. It's the ability to read between words, to detect shifts in tone, to recognize intentions before they're fully expressed. An empath doesn't just hear what you say, they register what you mean, what you hide, and sometimes even what you haven't admitted to yourself yet. That kind of perception is not fragile, it's precise. But here's where the miscalculation happens. When someone consistently experiences that level of understanding without consequence, they begin to test it. They push boundaries subtly at first, small dismissals, slight manipulations, moments of disrespect wrapped in plausible deniability. And because the empath sees the deeper layers, they often choose patience, not because they don't notice, but because they do. They understand the insecurity behind the behavior, the pain driving it, the patterns that shaped it. And that patience gets misread. It gets labeled as acceptance. It gets interpreted as permission. The empath becomes, in the other person's mind, someone who will always absorb, always forgive, always stay. And that's where the dynamic becomes dangerous. Because the more someone underestimates an empath, the more they reveal themselves. Every act of disrespect, every moment of dishonesty, every attempt at control, it all gets logged, processed, and understood on a level most people don't even realize is happening. The empath isn't reacting impulsively. They're observing. They're gathering data. They're connecting patterns. And while it may look like nothing is happening on the surface, internally, a threshold is being approached. This is the part most people never see coming, because they're focused on the empath's softness, not their awareness. They mistake emotional depth for emotional dependency. But empathy doesn't mean attachment, it means perception. And once perception reaches a certain level of clarity, it becomes impossible to ignore what's actually happening. At that point, the empath doesn't become angry in the way people expect. They become certain. Certain about who you are, certain about what you bring into their life, and most importantly, certain about what they will no longer tolerate. So when people say, they broke the wrong empath, what they're really saying is they misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. They thought they were interacting with someone who would endure anything. In reality, they were interacting with someone who was quietly deciding everything. And once that decision is made, there's no negotiation left. So the question isn't whether an empath is strong or weak. The real question is this: are you paying attention to the difference between someone who is being patient with you and someone who is slowly realizing they don't need you at all? What most people expect when someone reaches their limit is an explosion. Raised voices, emotional confrontations, dramatic exit, something visible, something undeniable. But that expectation comes from a misunderstanding of how certain minds operate under pressure, especially the empathic mind. An empath's breaking point doesn't look like chaos. It looks like clarity. For a long time, they absorb. Not blindly, but consciously. They process behavior, justify intentions, and extend understanding far beyond what most people would consider reasonable. They don't react immediately because they're not just responding to the moment, they're evaluating patterns over time. They're asking themselves, is this who this person really is, or is this a temporary deviation? And more often than not, they give the benefit of the doubt. But patterns, when repeated, stop looking like accidents. They start looking like choices. And this is where the shift begins quietly, internally, almost invisibly. The empath stops arguing not because they've given up their voice, but because they've gathered enough evidence. They stop trying to fix things, not because they don't care, but because they've recognized that their effort isn't creating change. What used to trigger emotional responses now triggers observation. What used to spark dialogue now leads to silence. This silence is often misinterpreted. The other person assumes things are improving. Less conflict must mean less tension, right? But in reality, the opposite is happening. The empath is detaching. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately. They are recalibrating their internal boundaries, pulling back their energy, and preparing for a decision that, once made, rarely gets reversed. Because when an empath reaches that point, they're no longer negotiating with potential, they're responding to reality. And reality, when seen clearly enough, removes the need for dramatic closure. There's no desire to prove a point, no need to win an argument, no urgency to make the other person understand. That phase has already passed. The empath has already done the explaining, the forgiving, the hoping. What remains is acceptance of what is, rather than what could be. That's why their exit feels so sudden to the outside world. One day they're present, engaged, trying. The next, they're distant, unavailable, done. But what looks like a sudden change is actually the result of a long internal process that went unnoticed. A series of small realizations that accumulated into one irreversible conclusion. And here's the part that catches people off guard the most. There's no emotional chaos attached to it. No anger driving them back, no guilt pulling them forward, just a calm, grounded certainty that staying is no longer aligned with their well-being. That kind of decision doesn't come from impulse. It comes from understanding. So when someone says an empath just walked away, what they're really describing is the final stage of a process that started long before anyone was paying attention. A process built on observation, reflection, and ultimately self-respect. And once that process reaches its conclusion, there's nothing left to argue about. Because when an empath becomes silent, it doesn't mean they have nothing to say, it means they've already said everything. And now they're choosing to listen to something far more important, their own clarity. If you really want to understand where the shift happens, you have to look at how an empath invests. Not casually, not transactionally, but deeply. They don't just give time or attention, they give presence. They listen beyond words, they anticipate needs, they step in before they're asked, and most of the time they do it without keeping score. That's what makes the dynamic so easy to misread, because from the outside it looks like an endless supply. It looks like someone who will always be there, always understand, always make space. But what's actually happening is far more complex. The empath is constantly evaluating consciously or not whether their investment is creating something meaningful or simply sustaining something one-sided. At first, they lean toward generosity. They assume imbalance is temporary. Maybe the other person is going through something. Maybe they just need time. So the empath compensates. They give a little more, wait a little longer, explain a little clearer. Not out of naivety, but out of a belief that effort, when applied correctly, can restore balance. But effort without reciprocity doesn't create connection. It creates depletion. And depletion, when it goes unacknowledged, turns into awareness. The empath begins to notice a pattern not just of what they're giving, but of what they're not receiving. It's not always obvious. It's in the small things. The lack of consideration, the absence of accountability, the subtle expectation that they will continue to show up regardless of how they're treated. This is where the internal dialogue changes. It moves from how can I help this person to why am I the only one trying? And that question is critical because it disrupts the entire dynamic. It forces a level of honesty that can't be ignored. The empath starts to see that what they thought was connection may actually be dependency, one-sided, unbalanced, and ultimately unsustainable. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people don't realize they're benefiting from this imbalance. They become accustomed to the empath's effort. It becomes the baseline. So when the empath starts to pull back even slightly, it feels like something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. Something is finally being corrected. Because emotional investment, no matter how deep, is not infinite. There is a limit. Not because the empath runs out of compassion, but because they develop standards. They begin to understand that empathy doesn't require self-abandonment, that caring for someone else doesn't mean neglecting themselves. And once that realization takes hold, their behavior changes in a way that can't be undone. They stop overextending. They stop explaining the same boundaries repeatedly. They stop trying to earn a level of respect that should have been present from the beginning. And most importantly, they stop giving to people who only value what they receive, not who they're receiving it from. This isn't bitterness, it's precision. The empath is no longer reacting from emotion alone, they're acting from clarity. They've recognized that where there is no mutual investment, there is no real connection. And continuing to pour into that kind of dynamic doesn't make them strong, it makes them unavailable to something better. So when that shift happens, it doesn't come with an announcement. It comes with a quiet withdrawal of energy. Less effort, less access, less availability. Not as punishment, but as alignment. Because at some point, the empath understands a fundamental principle. If someone only values you for what you give, then the moment you stop giving is the moment you discover what you actually meant to them. And that realization changes everything. There comes a point in this process where the empath realizes something most people spend years avoiding. Not every situation can be resolved through communication. Not every misunderstanding is accidental. And not every person is interested in understanding you no matter how clearly you explain yourself. Up to this point, the empath has likely tried every verbal route available. They've clarified intentions, expressed concerns, adjusted their tone, chosen their words carefully. They've had the difficult conversations, the patient conversations, the repeated conversations, and each time they've done it with the assumption that if they can just articulate things well enough, the other person will meet them halfway. But eventually, a pattern becomes undeniable. The same issues resurface, the same boundaries are crossed, the same explanations are ignored or twisted, and at some level the empath recognizes a hard truth. The problem isn't a lack of communication, it's a lack of willingness on the other side. That realization changes the strategy entirely. Because once you understand that someone is committed to misunderstanding you, continuing to explain yourself stops being productive. It becomes a form of self-exhaustion. You're no longer communicating to create clarity or repeating yourself in a system that benefits from your confusion. This is where silence enters, not as avoidance, but as intelligence. The empath begins to withdraw from unnecessary dialogue. They stop engaging in circular arguments that never lead anywhere. They stop defending their intentions to people who have already decided how they want to perceive them. And perhaps most importantly, they stop volunteering emotional access to those who misuse it. From the outside, this shift can look like detachment, even indifference. The person who once explained everything now says very little. The one who used to engage deeply now responds with distance. And for those who are accustomed to constant access, this silence feels unsettling. But the silence isn't empty, it's deliberate. It's a boundary that doesn't require permission. It's a form of communication that doesn't rely on words, because sometimes the most effective way to change a dynamic is not to argue within it, but to remove yourself from it entirely. And there's a deeper layer to this. Silence forces accountability in a way that words often can't. When the empath stops explaining, the other person is left alone with their own behavior without distraction, without justification, without someone there to absorb or reinterpret it. And not everyone is comfortable with that kind of reflection. So they may try to provoke a reaction. They may push for engagement, test the silence, attempt to pull the empath back into the old pattern. But the difference now is that the empath sees it clearly. What once felt like confusion now looks like predictability. And predictability is easy to step away from. This is the moment where power shifts not through control, not through confrontation, but through restraint. The empath no longer feels the need to prove anything, fix anything, or win anything. They've moved beyond that stage. What they're protecting now is not the relationship, it's their own clarity. Because once you've seen a pattern for what it is, participating in it becomes a choice. And silence is often the first sign that the empath has chosen differently. So when you encounter that quiet distance, don't mistake it for weakness or absence. It's something far more intentional than that. It's the sound of someone who has finally realized that not every battle is meant to be fought out loud, and that sometimes. The strongest position you can take is the one where you say nothing at all. At some point, what looked like damage starts to reveal itself as direction. What felt like being worn down begins to feel more like being sharpened. And this is where the real transformation takes place, not in how the empath sees others, but in how they begin to see themselves. Because for most of their lives, their identity has been tied to how much they can hold, how much they can understand, how much they can carry for other people. Their value, consciously or not, has been measured by their usefulness in someone else's emotional world. And while that ability is powerful, it becomes dangerous when it's left unguarded. So the shift doesn't come from losing empathy. It comes from redefining it. The empath starts to realize that understanding someone doesn't obligate them to tolerate that person. That recognizing someone's pain doesn't mean excusing their behavior. And most importantly, that being able to see the good in someone doesn't mean ignoring the harm they cause. This is where discernment replaces instinct. Before, the empath would feel first and evaluate later. Now they begin to observe first and choose deliberately. They start asking different questions, not what does this person need from me, but what does this interaction cost me? Not how can I fix this, but is this even mine to fix? Those questions create space. And in that space, something new develops boundaries that are no longer negotiable. These aren't loud, aggressive lines drawn in reaction to conflict. They're quiet internal standards that guide behavior without the need for constant explanation. The empath no longer feels the urge to justify why something doesn't feel right. They trust that it doesn't and that's enough. And with that trust comes a different kind of confidence. Not the kind that needs validation, but the kind that comes from alignment. They begin to move differently. They disengage sooner. They recognize manipulation without needing to prove it. They stop giving people the benefit of the doubt when those people have consistently demonstrated who they are. This is often the moment when others say, "You've changed, and they're right." But what they're really noticing is that the empath is no longer participating in dynamics that require them to shrink, overextend, or self-abandon. The accessibility that once existed is now selective. The patience that was once unconditional is now earned. The empathy that was once freely given is now directed with intention. This isn't coldness, it's precision. The empath hasn't lost their ability to care, they've refined it. They've learned that empathy, when applied without boundaries, becomes self-neglect. But when it's paired with clarity, it becomes one of the most powerful tools a person can have. Because now, they're not just feeling, they're choosing. And that choice changes everything. They no longer stay where they're not respected. They no longer invest where there is no return of effort or integrity. They no longer confuse familiarity with connection. Every interaction is filtered through a new standard. Does this align with who I've become, or does it pull me back into who I had to be to survive? That level of awareness creates a kind of independence that can't be manipulated. Because once someone understands their own value not intellectually, but behaviorally, they become very difficult to access in the old ways. So what looked like breaking was never destruction. It was construction. It was the process of removing what no longer fits and reinforcing what does. And once that process is complete, the empath doesn't just return to who they were, they become someone far more deliberate. Because the most powerful version of an empath is not the one who feels everything for everyone, but the one who knows exactly where their empathy belongs and has the discipline to keep it there. By the time most people recognize what they had, the conditions that made it available are already gone. And that's the part that's hardest to accept, not the loss itself, but the realization that it didn't happen suddenly. It happened gradually, through a series of overlooked moments that didn't seem significant at the time. Because when an empath is present in your life, they often normalize things that are actually rare. Consistent understanding, emotional patience, the ability to absorb tension without escalating it. They make it easy to feel heard, even when you're not particularly clear. And over time, that kind of presence becomes familiar, so familiar that it stops being recognized as valuable. It becomes expected. An expectation, when it replaces appreciation, changes the entire dynamic. The empath's effort is no longer acknowledged, it's assumed. Their patience is no longer respected, it's relied on. Their willingness to stay is no longer seen as a choice, it's treated like a guarantee. That's where the disconnect begins. Because while one person is settling into comfort, the empath is still observing, still processing, still noticing the subtle shift from mutual respect to one-sided access. And although they may not address it immediately, it doesn't go unnoticed. It accumulates quietly, steadily beneath the surface, until it reaches a point where the empath no longer sees the relationship the same way. And when that internal shift happens, it doesn't come with a warning. It doesn't arrive as a threat or an ultimatum. It arrives as a decision, one that is already accounted for every conversation, every effort, every moment where things could have been different but weren't. So when the empath finally pulls back, it feels abrupt to the other person, unexpected, even unfair, because from their perspective, nothing major happened. There was no defining incident, no clear breaking moment. Just a change in behavior that seems out of proportion to the situation. But what they're reacting to is not a single moment. It's the accumulation of many. And this is where regret starts to surface, not always immediately, but inevitably. Because once the empath's presence is gone, the absence becomes noticeable in ways that weren't apparent before. Conversations feel different. Interactions feel thinner. The emotional depth that once existed is no longer there to stabilize things. And people begin to realize that what they had wasn't ordinary. It was someone who made an effort to understand them, even when it wasn't convenient. Someone who stayed engaged, even when things were difficult. Someone who offered consistency in a world where most people are conditional. And those qualities, once lost, are not easily replaced. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Recognition doesn't restore access. Understanding what you lost doesn't bring it back. Because the empath didn't leave out of confusion, they left out of clarity. And clarity, once reached, doesn't reverse itself just because someone else has finally caught up. That's why attempts to reconnect often feel different. The same words don't land the same way. The same gestures don't carry the same weight. Because the empath is no longer engaging from the same place. They've moved forward, not emotionally away, but structurally beyond. And that distance is not about punishment. It's about alignment. They're no longer available in the way they once were not, because they've lost the capacity to care, but because they've learned the cost of giving it without discernment. What used to be open is now protected. What used to be automatic is now intentional. So when people say they broke the wrong empath, what they're really confronting is the consequence of underestimating something they didn't fully understand until it was gone. And by then, the lesson is no longer about the empath, it's about them. Because the truth is simple, even if it's difficult to accept. The moment you realize the value of someone who gave you everything is often the same moment you realize you no longer have access to it. And if there's anything worth taking from that, it's this: learn to recognize depth while it's still present, not after it becomes a memory you can't return to.